I think it's time for us to have her speak about her work and bring us in. Anytime anybody wants to ask us a question, just ask me and I'll throw this to you.
Amazing. I'm just going to get everything shared. All right, excellent. I guess we can dive right into things. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers of BayHi for having me here today. And also thank y'all for coming to hear me speak, both online and in person. Really appreciate it. Again, I'm Cyan, and today I'll be presenting on immersive virtual environment, how avatar representation can shape user experiences in social virtual reality. But first, a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Spring Valley, New York, but currently I'm a PhD candidate here at Stanford, working with the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, as well as the Human-Computer Interaction Group. My research focuses on social and embodied experiences in augmented and virtual reality. I'm especially interested in how these tools can be used to facilitate social connectedness, belonging, learning, and also creativity. My approach to research is interdisciplinary. I work across both the communication and computer science department. And my approach is that, I really try to examine the psychological, behavioral, and social implications of AR and VR, but also thinking about what are the design implications for future interfaces. And I do this through both studying existing interfaces, like a lot of the work we'll be discussing today, as well as also rebuilding them. In addition to my academic experiences, I've also spent some time working in industry. Before graduate school, I was a software engineer at Google. Last year, I was a research scientist intern at Microsoft, where I explored the use of models for creating interactive VR environments in real time. And this summer, I'll be a research scientist intern at Meta Reality Labs. So just to provide a roadmap of today's presentation, we'll first begin with an overview of what social VR is, just to bring everyone on the same page. Then we'll talk a bit more about the concept of avatar embodiment as it exists within this context and how avatars are meaningful to its users. Afterwards, we'll dive into the implications of avatar representation, the nature representation impact how people are. Then we'll speculate a little bit about what the future of avatar embodiment might look like, especially as it intersects with artificial intelligence. Afterwards, we'll discuss the ethical implications of avatars and avatar embodiment. And then finally, I'll end with a few takeaways as we transition into the Q&A portion. So let's begin with some definitions, shall we? What is social VR? Well, to answer this, we must first understand what VR, or virtual reality, is. So virtual reality can be understood as a medium that generates these movement-responsive, interactive computer simulations that replace or augment the human senses. While not all definitions are technology-specific, many emphasize devices that create immersion. Some of us beforehand were talking about cave VR environments, which are when you're in a room where all these walls create this sense of immersion in a virtual world. But some of the more well-known examples are these use of these head-mounted displays or VR headsets that cover your eyes, cover your field of view, and make you feel like you're in the virtual environment. In the early days of VR, these headsets were a bit more bulky and primarily used in industry and research settings, such as in this image I have of a person at NASA wearing a headset. But over the past decade, we've seen some major technological advancements in VR headsets, making them lighter, more affordable, and also accessible to a growing consumer market. Companies such as Apple, Google, Meta, and Vive have respectively been investing in this market and releasing their own headsets to the consumers. But beyond hardware, a key element that defines virtual reality is a sense of presence that it mediates. Presence is a psychological sensation characterized by the feeling of being there, where even though we know what we're seeing isn't real, it can feel like it's real. One way to illustrate this is through the Planck experience, which I have an image here from Richie's Planck experience. We have a similar version in my lab, the Virtual Human Interaction Lab, where we have this plank over this deep pit. We ask people to walk across the plank and back. We have them go to the center of the plank, turn over, look down, and then we ask them to jump off. And usually people actually hesitate when doing this. Again, we know it's not real, but it feels real when you're looking down into the pit, myself included, right? So we actually have to like be on standby to make sure no one falls over as they step off the plank. But this has to do with, again, this sense of presence and feeling like you're actually there. But beyond the sense of facial presence, one experiences in VR, there are other types of presence that are very important to this experience, which brings us back to the question of what social VR is. So social VR, it's this emerging ecology of platforms where users interact with each other in immersive 3D virtual environments. The network capabilities of these platforms allow users to experience virtual worlds together, contributing to social presence, which is the feeling of being there together. In my PhD, I've had the opportunity to TA for Stanford's virtual people class, taught by my advisor, Jeremy Bailenson. And this was around the time of COVID where people were exploring different formats for what the remote class could look like. Thus, we created one of the first and largest classes to take place almost entirely in VR. The quarter I took it was over 100 students. They were each lent a MetaQuest 2 headset to use for the quarter. And they had homework assignments in VR. We met in VR. A lot of the class was done actually in VR. And on this slide, you could see a moment where we were taking a picture together. So in this class, we took advantage of this enhanced sense of social presence that you have in virtual reality by hosting our discussion sections in VR. So as a TA, every week I put on my headset and I host 8 discussion sections in locations across the university or at home if they're still there. And we gather in a circle and we talk about different topics related to VR based on the class. And the thing about this is that the embodied nature of the avatars in VR made communication in the medium feel similar to communicating face-to-face. After all, we were still able to benefit from the nonverbal cues of, eye gaze, people raising each other's hands, the things we were able to keep as we transitioned into this virtual environment. And we also had this ability to customize our virtual environments. Although we're in a warehouse in this picture, every week we were somewhere different. Sometimes we were talking in a forest, other times we were around a bonfire because we could do that in VR, right? But what I found really interesting is because the class was fully remote, I got to know students primarily through their avatars. Like I hardly saw them, right? So I knew them through how their avatar looked, what behaviors they did in their avatar. Like maybe they're teleporting around and they have this haptic platforms. Some of them like to shadow box with each other. So that was an interesting thing that came out of this. And we used Engage VR as a platform which steers toward these more realistic looking avatars and business casual attire. But there's this whole ecosystem of social VR environments, each with their own cultures and aesthetics for how they approach the representation of their avatars. On this slide, you can see Horizon World, Rec Room, VR Chat, and of course, Engage. Some avatars are more toward the human side, others are non-human. Some are more realistic looking, others are cartoony. So it can really vary. But the thing about avatars is that it hits on this third type of presence, which is the presence that one feels within their own virtual body. So this is also described as avatar embodiment, which brings us to the next part of this presentation, exploring the importance of this phenomenon in social VR. So just to reiterate, avatar embodiment is a psychological sensation where the virtual self is experienced as the actual self, where it feels like your avatar body becomes your own embodied. And unlike traditional desktop-only virtual worlds, the use of both head-mounted displays and controllers allows this novel form of avatar-mediated communication where users' physical movements sync with their avatar's movement in real time. So when you move, you see your avatar moves. And this experience can make embodying an avatar in social VR feel more personal and perhaps engaging compared to experiencing the avatar in traditional virtual worlds. And also perhaps one of the reasons why it's an important part of the experience in social VR. To further illustrate this, let's go back to the virtual people class I mentioned earlier. Given the novelty of a course like this at the time, we ran multiple different research studies surrounding it, where at the beginning of the quarter, students had the opportunity to opt in or opt out to whether or not they wanted to be a part of the research studies surrounding this class. In one of these studies, we looked into what were the most popular topics that students talked about during their discussion sections over the course of the class. This data set consisted of over 4,800 minutes of group conversation, and we explored, all right, what are the most common words used? How do they together to form themes? And also, which themes occurred most frequently? And what we found was that avatar embodiment was the most robust theme that students discussed over the course of the class. One reason that this might be is because of the VR-centric nature of the class. It was a class about VR, so it should be expected that focus that participants had of the virtual representations of the self. That's the way I can put it, is that when I am in this avatar, I feel more comfortable, feel more confident. It very much feels not like a mask, but a mask has been removed.
Okay, that's good. All right, test, how does that sound? Great. All right, awesome. So yes, avatars, confidence. For this person, help them feel confident, and also how it was kind of a reprieve from societal expectations for them. Building on this, I spoke to another user about her experience as a transgender woman on the platform. And she described, I'm not out in real life for a multitude of reasons. Here's how I express how I wish I could be in real life. So here is an example of avatars as a medium for identity exploration, and in this case, gender exploration, which builds on this scholarship by Sherry Turkle on viewing virtual worlds as identity workshops, where users can explore different aspects of their self-concept, in part through the avatar. And then this last example, I spoke to a user who often wore an avatar, and they said, I just like being a happy little cat. It's just the personality I'm conveying is, I guess, more fun, you know? That's what I'm going for in VR. With VR Surprise, I'm actually playing this game to have fun. So here, it was about having fun and also conveying their personality to other people. This gets at how past scholars have described avatars in social VR as either social lubricants or social deterrents, where the representation of avatar, you know, its appearance, race, gender, etc., either invites or discourages interactivity. So based on how your avatar looks, it might affect who is approaching you, how they're approaching you, and what people are approaching you. So it's not uncommon for users to take this into account, the perception of their avatar when deciding its representation, such as this person who liked wearing cats because they wanted to show that they were having fun. That said, for some users, there are still elements of their real-world identity that they wanted reflected in their avatar's representation. I found this to be a topic of participants of color who wanted characteristics of their racial identity represented within their avatar. One of them said they didn't need their avatar to look exactly like them, but they wanted it to be similar enough such that it felt like them while they were in VR. And for them, it was having the right eye shape, having the right skin color, etc. So this kind of shows how there are certain features that avatars that can be particularly important as they're curating their appearance. And sometimes this can be shaped by offline identity. One way to think about this is through the social constructionist approach and the relational approach to avatar customization. Under the social constructionist approach, to avatar selection, the offline self is not the starting point in the formulation of the virtual self. They can create avatars that are completely disconnected from themselves IRL. However, under the relational approach, a user self and decides, okay, what are the features I want to actualize? What do I want to idealize? And also, what do I want to make different? We further explored the relational approach and also avatar qualities that are important to users. We did a study where we had participants customize an avatar that we said that looks and feels like you. We analyzed their behavior during this customization process as a proxy for their attentional focus when engaging in avatar customization. We created timelines for each person where we got to see what feature they were editing at any particular timestamp. Here we used Ready Player Me as the platform. So through doing this, we found that many participants spend most of their time looking at clothing and hair selection options, perhaps suggesting their importance when it comes to allowing users to customize these features when curating their virtual appearance. And especially in this case where we wanted them to look and feel like themselves. So just to this section all together, VR allows users to customize appearances that actualize, idealize, and alter different features of their physical selves. In addition to this, users have various motivations for selecting their representations, including exploring identity, conveying personality, and also representing different aspects of their core identity. But I'd also like to point out that the nature of this representation can really depend on the context, right? You know, how you represent yourself in a classroom discussion section or a professional setting might be different than, you know, what you're wearing when you're socializing with people. And this can also be shaped by the platform itself, right? Again, engage, more realistic, more business casual, right? A little less freedom as to what you can be versus VR chat. You saw human, non-human, like this box on the screen, right? So the platform itself too can shape the avatar culture and practices of its users. So now that we understand the importance of users and how they might approach choosing their avatar, it is worth questioning what impact does this choice have on them and their user experience. One of the key things here is that avatars can shape the behavioral and psychological experience of users in VR. In other words, how one's avatar looks can impact their actions and how they feel while they're immersed in their virtual environment. So some early insight on this phenomenon can be traced back to the Proteus effect. This is a theory coined by Nick Yee and Jeremy Bailenson that posits that users conform to the expected behaviors of their avatar based on its appearance, based on its looks, right? So for example, they ran a study and they found that wearing a taller avatar contributed to more confident behaviors in a negotiation task compared to wearing a shorter avatar. Avatars have also been shown to impact how people move around in virtual space. A more recent study found that they had people wear virtual high heels and virtual sneakers, and they found that they walked differently based on the virtual shoes they were wearing, right? There were different gaits and hip flexions, etc., right? So again, avatars, just based on how it looks, it impact how people move while they're in the virtual world. I've also done some guest lectures, right, where I talk about avatar embodiment, and then I have people go into social VR together. And I've been able to observe a little bit of the Proteus effect. On this slide, I have an example. We were initially in all the avatars we chose, but then someone found a small little rat avatar. Then everyone started including the rat avatar, and we were all small little rats in this virtual world, and we were just acting playful around because the avatars just made us want to be playful. So I was able to observe some of the differences in what happened before when people were wearing maybe more humanoid avatars versus when we all became these small little rat creatures. So this topic of how avatar representation shapes psychology and behavior has been salient to one of my threads of research that I've led and also collaborated on in my time here at Stanford. So in this next part of the talk, I'll talk about, diving into some of 4 different studies that touch on the impact of avatar representation in virtual reality. So first one was part of the virtual people class and led by my colleague Ugi Han. So during one quarter of the class, in different weeks, students embodied either an avatar that they customized to represent themselves, or they chose a more uniform avatar that was designed to be more racially and gender ambiguous. So on this slide, you see the uniform avatar on the left side, and then the customized avatars or examples of customized avatars in the right. And the goal of this study was to see how does transforming the representation of an avatar shape social interaction as well as presence. We found that wearing customized self-avatars increased participants' sense of self-presence, aka avatar embodiment, as well as non-verbal synchrony with other students in the class compared to wearing uniform avatars. For those unfamiliar with synchrony, it's when people exhibit similar behaviors at similar times. So it's kind of like reused animation. And past research has shown that higher motion synchrony to be related to greater rapport building as well as creativity. So hence in this context, allowing users to customize self-avatars contributed to psychological and behavioral factors that shaped how they felt in their avatar, as well as potentially how they cultivated relationships with other people in the class. We explored the role of the self-avatar further in a separate study where our goal was to understand how do discrepancies between the avatar self and the physical self influence avatar embodiment while in VR. This work was informed by self-discrepancy theory, a theory by Higgins, which posits that greater discrepancy between different domains of the self can lead to psychological discomfort. So for example, if you feel like who you actually are is different than who you ideally are or who you ought to be, it can feel a bit uncomfortable. Other scholars have taken this and shown this to also be the case within virtual environments. For us, we measured the sense of discrepancy as perceived differences between the avatar self and the physical self. We invited users to imagine themselves and their avatar standing side by side, and they compared differences between the two. So how different is your avatar's hairstyle from your own style? How different is your avatar's skin color from your own skin color, et cetera, et cetera. And we specifically chose features that have been shown to be important to avatar representation. So just to walk through the process of what participants did, first we had them do a tutorial of just the platform they're about to go into. Then they spent some time on their respective social VR platform. For this study, we did both Rec Room and VR Chat to have some, stimulus sampling. And while they're in VR, of course, they had to spend some time selecting their avatar, customizing their avatar based on the, whatever the platform had them do. Then we had them engage in this avatar familiarization task where they completed a set of poses in front of a virtual mirror, just to kind of get them avatars moving, I'm moving, and attempting to induce that sense of the body ownership illusion. And finally, they just spent some time exploring a public virtual world where they just walked around, perhaps interacted with other users, etc. And then afterward, they completed a survey that measured avatar discrepancy and avatar embodiment. One key from this is that we found that greater discrepancies in attributes correlated to experiencing less avatar embodiment. In other words, perceiving their avatar as more different from themselves made them feel less presence within their virtual body. And so if we're considering avatar embodiment as one metric of the user experience in VR, what this demonstrates is an embodied implication of discrepancy and a potential motive for designing avatar systems that allow users to create avatars like themselves. However, an issue arises when, what if a user wants to authentically rep themselves, but is unable to do so? And while it should be expected that no one is able to create an exact version of themselves in VR, at least in where we are right now, if you look at the history of video games, there has been like, not everyone has had the equal chance of representing themselves online, right? As we see from these news articles I've gathered from, this is recent, this is between 2020 and 2023, showing that yes, a lot of progress has been made, but there is still a ways to go. Even in social VR, there's been research showing gaps in representations for women in middle age, people with disabilities, and also body diversity, like has been cited as places where representation can be improved within social VR, right? So this led me to wanting to explore the embodied implementation, but particularly on a population that has been neglected when it comes to the design of avatar customization systems, as well as underrepresented within VR research. And for that was a focus on the user experiences of Black users in social VR. So just to really understand what is at stake when issues of representation are brought into the more immersive medium of VR. So we did this user study with 41 Black users, and we invited them to create an avatar that looked and felt like them. So first, again, they did this avatar familiarization task where they moved around their body just to get more oriented with it, right? Then they spent some time talking to each other, whether it was talking to other participants or talking to a researcher in the room, just to make sure they had the social part of the social virtual reality. And lastly, they spent some time drawing during a 3D drawing task where they had this 3D pencil and then they could just draw whatever they wanted to, just to kind of have fun while they're in the virtual world. We also manipulated the presence and absence of a virtual mirror, where either a virtual mirror was present the entire time or it was absent the entire time. Because after all, seeing your avatar from a first person point of view might be a bit different than if a mirror is there, right? And on VR chat, they have the ability to toggle on and off a mirror in a lot of their virtual worlds. So that's what we used. Although I will point out that not a lot of social VR platforms have virtual mirrors, which is interesting. But in VR chat, there's like the specific mirror culture that exists where there's these things called mirror dwellers, where they sit in front of mirrors and just like to look at themselves. Anyways, I say that to say we had mirrors because we wanted to manipulate the salience of one's avatar while they went through this activity. What we found was that across all, greater avatar discrepancy was associated with less spatial presence. Again, where avatar perceived as more different from the self was linked to less presence within their virtual environment. We also found that in the absence of a virtual mirror, more discrepancy was associated with less avatar embodiment and less spatial presence. But interestingly, as you can see from this table, this is not the case for the mirror condition, which might be a bit confusing at first, right? You might think that, okay, like if I'm looking at and I'm seeing the ways that my avatar is different, I'm more self-focused on it, and maybe that's affecting my embodiment. But a potential explanation for this can be traced to the fact that mirrors help promote the body ownership illusion, right? Seeing your avatar's movements sync with your own movements can make it feel like, okay, this is my own body, regardless of like, okay, how discrepant it is, right? Versus in the absence of a virtual mirror, it is able to benefit from that. So that's one potential explanation for these results. But another potential explanation has to do with behavioral realism, because viewing your avatar in a mirror can help enforce behavioral realism. And for those who are familiar, behavioral realism is the extent to which an avatar behaves as we'd expect it to behave in the real world. So if you're in a realistic human avatar in VR, you expect it to move like a human. You don't expect it to like cave in on itself for its limbs to contort in weird ways. Versus if you're in a more cartoony avatar, or even an avatar with just like head and hands, like you're a bit more forgiving in how you expect it to act, right? And it's been shown to be, in some cases, more important than how photographically real an avatar looks. So being able to look at their avatar in the mirror enhance the sense of behavioral realism that I had, and perhaps further encourage the sense of avatar embodiment that a user experienced. So just to reiterate some takeaways from this study, here we found that there are some embodied consequences to discrepancies when people aimed to create avatars that looked and felt like themselves, and in some cases were unable to do so authentically. And while we expect that there are some instances where we want to carry over physical attributes into VR, as seen through my ethnography, but also perhaps in professional VR contexts. As we saw with this cat guy, there are also some cases who want to be something different, right? And, you know, on one hand, there are individual differences between people that shape their avatar motivations when they're customizing it. For example, there's been a lot of research on like non-VR avatars and how things like gender, personality, self-esteem can impact how they approach creating their avatar and representing themselves in social virtual worlds. But at the same time, I also spent some time thinking about what are contexts where being something different can be particularly advantageous, right? As we saw with this participant, perhaps something where someone wants to do something a little bit more playful while they're in VR. And one example of a playful social VR activity is dance. In fact, dance is an emerging form of technocultural activity on these platforms. People host virtual dance parties, have virtual dance classes, and there are also these virtual dance exer games that exist. And there are these ways for people to, engage in self-expression, find community, exercise is another big thing, and also just having fun, right? So past research has reported that wearing cartoon avatars while dancing in VR made them laugh, made them feel relaxed and playful while they engaged in this activity. However, while these findings, they're very valuable, these are some more qualitative findings. There hasn't been as much quantitative findings looking into this, and also using a large sample size. A lot of these are more focused, maybe a small group of 10 professional dancers, right? But I wanted to lean more into maybe running a large scale study on this phenomenon. Hence, in my most recent VR study, I explored the question of how do digital representations impact how people feel and move while they dance in social VR? And around 105 participants engaged in this study. As far as the context goes, we used VR chat and Just Dance VR. For those who don't know, Just Dance is this dance exer game where you follow the motions of a person dancing and copy its movements to engage in the game. And in virtual reality, they have Just Dance VR worlds, which allowed users to play Just Dance while being able to see their avatars in a virtual mirror. We randomly assigned participants to one of 3 avatar conditions where they either wore an avatar that they customized to, again, look and feel like you, or they wore a human avatar that was something different from what they customized, or they wore a cartoon avatar like you see on these slides where they're mostly non-human and just, fun looking in nature. And as far as procedure goes, they first spent just a couple minutes viewing their avatar in a mirror. Then in groups, they engaged in this Just Dance VR activity, which lasted around 4 to 4.5 minutes. Following this, they completed a survey about their experience. And then we had just a group conversation about what went on, how did they feel while they were dancing in VR around other people. So analysis for this is admittedly still ongoing, but there are some preliminary findings that I can share with you today. And that is that participants who wore a human avatar or a cartoon avatar that did not resemble their physical appearance reported significantly greater playfulness scores than those who wore a self-similar avatar that they customized. So this could perhaps be attributed to the anonymity, right, that these other avatar categories get at, and making people feel more free, right, when they danced in something that felt different from themselves. And, we had more of a general population of people compared to professional dancers. So having something like this of wearing an avatar that made people feel more playful and perhaps less anxious was, I think, advantageous in this context. So again, here is a scenario where wearing an avatar that's different from them helps enhance aspects of their experience while in VR, right? Hence, for someone aiming to create a more playful VR experience might be interested in leaning a little bit more to this anonymous and perhaps playful side of the avatar optimization spectrum. So we just spoke a lot about why avatars are important, how people choose them, and also how it can impact their experience. But I want to take a quick moment on pondering what the future of avatar and VR might look like. I don't claim to be a futurist, but I'm going to do my best here. And eventually I'd actually be curious to hear about later what y'all think about what the future of avatars might look like in VR or elsewhere. Going back this past summer, I had the opportunity to intern at Microsoft with Jaron Lanier, who is considered one of the founders of virtual reality. From him, I learned more about the history of VR and how earlier on, people envisioned VR to be this place of spontaneous creation where groups of people could play virtual worlds into existence using virtual devices that resembled musical instruments. This would become for the research project I worked on called Speaking the World into Existence, where we explored how AI, specifically large language models, could be used for spontaneous world generation. Our focus was on using LLMs to help users create, these interactive virtual environments in real time using language-based prompts, right? So you could type, oh, create a virtual forest, and now a virtual forest appears and you're inside of it, or make this mug interactable, and now you can interact with this thing in the virtual environment. However, one might imagine an experience where a user could spontaneously edit their avatar in real time using AI or perhaps something else, right? Being able to request changes to their avatar's features on the fly and being unrestricted by what designers or developers initially had in mind, perhaps filling gaps of representation where it is needed. So this is one potential direction I see where it will hopefully become easier in the future for people to be able to spontaneously modify their avatar in real time while they're in virtual reality. So yes, discuss the potential future, but I really wanted to also spend a bit of time talking on the ethical implications of avatars as well, because as much as avatar embodiment can be additive to a user's experience, it could also lead to moments of discomfort as well. In a short paper I collaborated on, led by my colleague Daniel Axelrad, we identified communication failures that exist in social VR, which we described as embodied violation, where users would spawn into the same location and they could see inside of each other's virtual bodies, leading to awkward situations like what you see on this slide. And though we know, again, this is just a simulation, it can still feel like a violation of personal space due to the sense of presence that one feels in this virtual world. And unfortunately, there have been bad faith users who have taken advantage of this to engage in what scholars have called embodied harassment, where harassing behaviors are conducted and experienced through a sense of embodiment. So this might look like someone intentionally violating your virtual space. I've also observed, people wearing obscene avatars, or even avatars with extremely high polygon count, lots of graphical detail, with the intention of intentionally lagging or crashing another person's headset. So be careful when you go into public social VR worlds. So this makes the importance of avatar-based safety so important. So for example, in Meta Horizon worlds, there are these personal space boundaries where as you get closer to a person, if they fall within a certain distance from you, they disappear. And in VR chat, they have these trust and safety systems where, you can control who you see and who you hear based on how long have they been on the platform. Are they on friend list? Things to try to gauge the trustworthiness of a person and whether or not you should be able to see or hear their avatars. All right, let's end with some takeaways. So first, avatars, they're a core part of the experience in social VR. It's meaningful to a lot of users and promotes a sense of exploration, joy in their experience, right? But, it's important to know that there are psychological and behavioral implications of avatar representation that impact how people feel within their immersive environments, how they move around, and also how they interact with other people. Understanding the nature of these implications can help inform how one approaches the design of an avatar system and what they're trying to convey for how users interact with each other, the culture they want to promote, etc. And lastly, incorporating virtual mirrors can help promote avatar embodiments. You'd be surprised by the don't have mirrors, and maybe for good reason, but this is a way to help people feel embodied within their avatar in VR. All right, I'd love to acknowledge these wonderful people, including one in the audience, Portia, for being lovely collaborators to me in a lot of the research that I've presented here today. And yeah, thank you. Here's my contact information, and perhaps we can move on to the Q&A portion.
Well, thank you, Cyan. You speak beautifully.
Thank you so much.
Very organized. Nice talk. I have 3 questions. Maybe I'll ask one at a time. First of all, the idea that people made weird avatars and then were more creative. Do you think that was representative of them or their avatar? And how can you distinguish the two? Whether they, are more creative anyway, and that's why they made a different avatar, versus that it was really that they made that different avatar that made their experience more creative.
I see. Like as far as like the playfulness.
Yeah, you were saying playfulness, right?
Yeah. I think this kind of gets at well, one, there's this individual differences element that is important, I think, to keep track of. So in this particular study, we did in the analysis include personality as part of the thing that we had as part of our model, just to kind of remove that as a thing that soaked up the variance, right? So I do want to point out the one, taking considering individual differences between people is something that you kind of have to do, right? But even after we took that into account, we did still find that significant effect. Mm-hmm. So yes, very important to keep into account, but also even taking that into account.
Yeah, so I could imagine making an experiment where you let them make a creative one, mm-hmm. and then you gave them a very normal one. It was really that they, that's just who they were. So
that great future work.
Some way to, yeah. The second one was side tone. You ever heard of side tone? No. Side tone's on a phone, and it's when they have the sound of your voice coming in through your ear. Mm. And without side tone, people speak much louder and more uncertainly. Mm-hmm. And then for a while, cell phones didn't have it, and they put it back and it improved things a lot. So I was thinking about this VR mirror as a side tone, mm-hmm. and maybe it's just a matter of it's confirmation, it's feedback that something's happening. Yeah. And do you think that is the important part, or do you think it's more important? I mean, what I guess I want to attribute that test. What to attribute that mirror's efficacy to?
Yeah, I think it's just, being able to see the visual motor synchrony that virtual reality actually provides, right? Like this element of being able to see your full body move with your actual physical body's movements. So I think that it has to do with in this case, in this more visual medium, how it can promote the sense of the body ownership illusion, and that behavioral realism that I had mentioned earlier.
Right, and I just wonder whether it's that feedback's better than no feedback. I mean, maybe it doesn't. Maybe the mirror could be anything. Mm. Maybe it could just be something showing that your VU meter. Yeah, that might have the same effect. I'm just wondering.
That's true, and I think there are other features that you can think about in giving that degree of feedback to movement, whether it's perhaps spatial audio cues to moving through a virtual space, or even I think in VR chat they've been exploring like having different like clothing and body parts of your avatar move as you move as well. So yeah, that it'd be a cool thing to look into the multi-sensory aspect beyond just a virtual mirror and receiving that feedback and how that then in turn affects his experience.
Maybe it makes no difference. Who knows? Yeah. The last one, they're kind of all in the same vein. So you had this avatar, and you attributed all these excitement things in dancing, for example, with an avatar. Mm-hmm. But how does that compare with dancing in a video conferencing system? And is the VR better in some way or worse?
Yeah, I can just hypothesize what I think would happen, although I haven't seen a specific study on this. But I think that what you get on VR is a sense of anonymity, right? Where you're in VR and yes, it's moving with you, but it's your avatar, right? Versus if you were dancing in a video conferencing system, you might feel a little bit more self-conscious, right? Because it's your actual body moving.
Proud.
Sorry?
Or proud.
Or proud, right? If you know what you're doing, that's great. But going back to that element of behavioral realism, right? If I am a banana, right, in VR and I'm moving around and it doesn't look great, okay, cool, it's fine. I'm a banana, right? So I think it gets to the point of anonymity that it provides.
Maybe.
And there has been past research showing anonymity in virtual environments being associated with more self-disclosure, the amount people share about themselves. So
Okay.
that's one of the effects that I see in this context.
Okay, good.
I'm Randy Farmer, the co-creator of the Avatar.
Yeah.
I worked on Lucasfilm's Habitat. I ran their first virtual worlds. And it's now open source for anyone who's out there. You can go to neohabitats.org and actually play the game. But that's not the important part. The important part is I have some questions. So I come from a very, very old school for avatars.
Mm-hmm.
There was no first-person presentation. That was, Jaron was working on stuff while we were working on that. But I want to tease out a couple of things that I think are implied, and it gives me questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask a question first. There's a thing where you're interviewing the furry floating. Now, was that your avatar, the Snowbite character?
Yes, I was the Ariel.
And when you were giving that avatar,
mm-hmm.
was the view we're seeing the view you were seeing? Was it third person, meaning you could see your avatar floating there talking to them?
It wasn't the third person perspective. It was just as though we're talking right now. That's how it looked.
All right, so you had the first person perspective, but
Exactly.
we saw the camera. So that's one of the things that's a little confusing in the presentation is where are the eyes?
Mm-hmm.
Where is let's call it the camera versus your eyes.
Yeah.
I think there's an implication that your eyes are always in your virtual head.
Mm-hmm.
So it begs the question, and think of all the contexts in which people were having fun. And when you brought up the mirror a lot, I just kept thinking, we used to call that third person.
Mm.
You didn't inhabit your head because you couldn't. So you were we had butt cam, we had all kinds of names for different ways that the camera would be rendered on your PC or your Mac as you were looking at your virtual avatar, participating in Second Life or anywhere else.
Mm.
Did you, first of all, do they offer those? And is it worth considering, which is, what does your avatar mean when your camera is not in your head? That's one. So we'll start with that question.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of that, or is it just, that's outside the scope?
I think that in the context of social VR environments, the way that it primarily has manifested has been, the closest thing is kind of the mirror or perhaps a camera that you could put and see yourselves. That said, I know in the context of augmented reality, researchers at the HCI have been exploring what different points of views look like.
Okay.
But as far as like the commercially available VR systems, the third person point of view is primarily induced either through mirrors or a camera point of view.
Okay, because for me, like dancing games and a lot of other, again, I don't actually own a VR headset, so
Mm-hmm.
cast me appropriately in that set of people. I've used caves and other things back in the day, but I've never found them very compelling myself. But I'm not everybody, so I'm asking you. Mm-hmm. Dancing games certainly would be just as fun to watch your avatar dance from the outside as inside, I guess. That would be a question to ask and test.
Yeah.
Sure. In fact, most dancing games are actually, before we put them in headsets, worked that way. The other one was about context, and dancing games comes to mind. You did this nice study trying to figure out, if representing yourself as accurately as you can, it has these benefits, these scores go up. What strikes me is, without considering context, I'm concerned. Mm-hmm. And I think the dance study really raises this concern, and I think it's worth digging in further, which is, why was it better, if you're going to be dancing, to not be yourself? Mm-hmm. Right? And the answer is, for me, context. Mm-hmm. You're entering a context in which being yourself is no benefit, and in fact may be a distraction. Mm-hmm. If we turn that around and say, it's not about constructing your avatar, it's about understanding the context and selecting your avatar. For example, you didn't do something that I've seen lots of avatar studies done decades ago, which is talking about clothing, contextual clothing or contextual outfits, or in my case, Habitat had heads, changing your head from, so the person who was wearing the cat avatar doesn't always wear the cat avatar, right? It's not them. It's a sense of costume as identity. I'm using that terminology myself. So have you considered looking off in those directions? So it's not just my avatar is this kind of monolithic thing, but it's fluid in numerous dimensions based on context.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, because context can definitely shape how people approach their avatars. Just to speak about how it has come up in my research, going back to the virtual ethnography, again, I spoke to 43 people who had their own take on how they represented themselves. Some of them are, this is like my main avatar, this is me, and if someone took this away, I wouldn't be me in VR, right? Versus others maybe had a bit more of a fluid identity. They also spoke about different contexts across different social VR platforms. Let's take Horizon Worlds and VR Chat, for example, right? Horizon Worlds is owned by Meta, right? And so someone was like, if I went in there, like, I feel like it's Facebook, like I gotta be myself, right? But here, I don't feel like I have to do that. So that's one side, right? People spoke about their own experience. In the context of the quantitative experience studies, something I didn't have as much time to dive into were some of the limitations of. For that, it was mainly like new social VR users, a lot of them going into VR for a certain amount of time. But you might imagine that your first time going to VR different than like if you spent months and months in it, right? Where you had some time to decide on your performer. Right, you don't have the context, right? So that definitely affects it. And that's part of why the third study, it's more recent one, the dance one. And I was trying to get more into, okay, like here's a more tailored context outside of just like generic social VR. So it's a really interesting topic you bring up. Thank you. An important thing to think about moving forward.
So other questions? I'm sure you've had some ideas during this talk. Just anything? No? Do you have something, Edwin, you want to ask? How about online?
I think we might have seen a hand in back as well.
Hi, I'm Sridhar. I work as a hardware design professional in the area. So I do design some of these small pieces of the big puzzle in this VR hardware, right? So specifically on the sensors, right, for the camera sensors. So I guess that's just my background. One aspect I was just curious in your research experience, right? I think you have also worked on AR based systems, right? Or maybe in the past. So I'm kind of curious how this embodiment aspect plays out in the AR equivalent, AR or the mixed reality, right? Wherein, like, it's still there's difference between it's not fully virtual, right? So I guess I was curious, have you done research on that, and what's the key differences, and what kind of factors play in?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. In my own research, it's as far as the avatar embodiment goes, that hasn't been the place I've explored it in the context of augmented reality and pass-through. But there has been some coming out of the Virtual Human Interaction Lab on social interaction in AR, particularly how people treat like seeing a virtual human in front of them, and like, when they walk, like you could like walking around it, things of that sort. So when you think about like maybe the future of conferencing systems and telepresence, you have this element of avatars as a way to represent other people, perhaps in a different environment. So that's a little bit less so about the representation. Probably see your hands while you're there, but more about how others are around you in the space and the social presence you feel within with those virtual humans. So I can share that paper with you. I think that'd be an example of like virtual humans, but brought into an AR context.
We have some questions online.
Yes.
Erwin Jankovic, do you want to speak?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hi. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. So my question basically is, have people also tried adding various behaviors or personality characteristics to the avatars in a similar way that you were choosing looks and clothing and face features? Because I could see a lot of uses for being able to show two avatars interacting with different personalities. I could see that in interpersonal communication. I know psychotherapists deal with those kinds of issues. So I think that would be an interesting extension of this kind of approach.
Yeah, for sure. And just to get to the question, this is about conveying personalities through the representation of an avatar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's the case. And you know, what I've spoken about with people and how they create avatars, maybe like, you know, I spoke to someone who was like, I wear this kind of more neutral avatar because I'm not trying to be too flashy, right? Versus others maybe having more eccentric avatar features and how they want to convey that to each other. And drawn to the interpersonal communication aspect of that, I think, again, it goes back to this idea of avatars as social lubricants and deterrents, right? How you convey yourself impacts how I interact with you, for better or for worse, honestly. So that in turn kind of, I think, gets at this element of conveying personality and how that then in turn shapes interpersonal communication within this context, right? It also makes a space for some interesting avatar behaviors that you can't do in the real world. One example is there's a cloning feature on VR chat where you can see someone's avatar and clone it and then you become them. And then that becomes a source of fun for people. So you could where people decide, hey, we're going to be the same avatars. In some sense, you know, we got the same thing going with same personality. Let's have fun together, like the rats I showed on the stage. So, but yeah, really lovely question. And I think a very important part of the experience there.
We have another question online. William?
Hey there. Hi, I'm
Hello.
Bill Smith. I had a funny anecdote that came to mind as I was watching you describe the mice and sort of being playful with each other. So I was at a wedding and the groomsmen like whip out these mullet wigs from nowhere and they start just going to town dancing. And then when they're done, like the mullets are just sitting on a table. And so the older people at the wedding, like the silver-haired people, including the priest who'd married them, like they start putting on these wigs and like going to town, just being like 20-year-olds. It was great. So I totally get what you're saying there. Like people inhabit these characters. Like it doesn't matter who they are in real life anymore. I was wondering what overlaps or things you've learned from embodied identity in other domains like theater, film, or even theme parks, right? Like there's, Mickey Mouse at a theme park, for example. And then I also had a follow-on question I was about to type, but just about voice fonts. Like, have you explored anything with voice, not just with visual personalities, but with voice font personalities? Thanks.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that very fun anecdote. I think that is definitely the case, as we saw with the mice. And as far as it bridges to your question on how it bridges to other domains, as I'm currently writing up this dance studies, I have looked into dance and performance. And part of my inspiration comes from costumes. Because based on a dance costume, they have different materials, different weights, different layers that then in turn affect a dancer's kinesthetic and somatic experience while they're dancing, right? They adjust and it also impacts how they feel while they're engaging in dance. Some may have like these more audio elements to it as well. So similar to the mullet, it's this example in this dance performance where it's like, okay, based on what someone is wearing as they engage in it, it can affect how they move around and feel while they engage in the performance. I will also like to talk about Nick Cave, who has these like things called sonic suits, which are these like big furry sonic suits that dancers like move around in and have different sounds. And it's a way kind of to conceal the identity within the dance process, right? And kind of erase things like gender, race, etc. So I think that looking toward performance is a really interesting thread and connection when thinking about like the avatar is the virtual dance costume. And voice fonts, no, I have not. In fact, I'm intrigued now to look more into that as a way to gauge someone's personality, because I mean, primarily they'd use something called like the Big Five personality traits to gauge that. But thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'd love to look more into that.
So I have one more question.
Yes.
As you were speaking, I was thinking about this statement you'd made that people spent more time on their clothing.
Yeah.
Did you try to normalize that across gender or other things, or was that true with men, women, children, old people, whatever?
Yeah. For that, we only really did descriptive statistics just to see what all was going on during this process. But it does sound like a really interesting step. In fact, we're hoping to maybe do a another paper really diving into those things. So yeah, thank you.
But it was half men, half women, or was it all?
I don't remember the exact breakdown, but it did consist of both men and women, and all of them were over the year of 18 years old.
Okay.
So, you know, that's a there for sure. But, you know, there is interesting literature too on the avatar creation practices of children. I think there's one about children in Minecraft and things of that
Well,
sort. So.
for what it's worth, my child, when he was 9, spent a long time designing his avatars for lots and lots of time with the clothing and everything. I mean,
yeah, if I could add a quick personal anecdote to that, one of the big things that got me interested in this, I just played a bunch of worlds when I was a kid. Like I similarly loved customizing. I played Club Penguin, Vantage, like all these different virtual world games. So I relate there. And that's also like, I don't know, earlier some of us were speaking about the importance of archiving these different digital worlds, especially in a lot of them that kind of get shut down after the fact. And it's important to kind of keep these parts of history and understanding these different technocultural behaviors as they exist over time and as they're emerging into like more immersive contexts. So, yeah.
Great. Are there any questions? We have going once, going twice. Is it
I think we
great?
have one more.
Well, we have one. Okay, good.
Nice catch.
Hi, I'm Sampada. I'm a UX designer, and I had a question. So while designing for users who want to be themselves as avatar and you as opposed to users who want to experiment with their avatars, what are some of the constraints that you had to work with?
As far as like in them being able to be either of those things? Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think the constraints really vary based on the platform, because different platforms have different limitations of what they allow people to be, right? Again, going back to Engage, it was more like you have to be this realistic person that looks like they're about to go to a conference, versus VR chat, all in VR chat are generated by its users. So you see this influence of pop culture in the avatars represented, but it also means that it could be harder for certain things that aren't maybe in pop culture to be represented, or it's kind of biased based on what the users create. So I think that some of the key limitations there are just based on whatever the culture the platform sets in their avatar representation, but that in turn has its own influence on who are the people who decide to set the platforms, right? They're kind of related to each other. So that's how I've seen that come up.
I have one more question.
Yeah, go for it.
With the prolonged interaction with the avatars, do users have any specific effect on their real life perspective or conception of what is virtual and what is real? And is there anything that you factor in while you design with respect to that? Or if so, what are the things that you factor in?
Yeah, I think what your question reminds me of a couple of things. One of them that it reminds me of this element of identity exploration while in VR. You know, what happens when you're in a space where maybe you're not around people you know in the real world, and maybe you have more freedom to explore domains of the self that you don't in real life. And sometimes you learn about those things and in turn influences how you see yourself in the outside world. So there's this, like, I think large part of the self-concept that is both reflected from the virtual space, but also that you bring into the virtual space. So yeah, and as far as like this, you know, there's some quote about how all reality is virtual reality. And some are like, yeah, there's just like this blurriness between what is real, what is virtual, you know, who am I? Broader philosophical questions, but also causing some when you come out of VR. There's this thing where people come out of VR and they kind of feel like they're floating in the environment because they spent so much time in VR. So yeah, that was a little all over the place, but I think the identity exploration work, especially by Sherry Turkle and others, is something to look into there.
So thank you very much. Great talk. A lot I'm sure people can learn, and it's really an interesting time. It's maybe the 6th time in my career that VR has come through and seemed like it was going to change thing. And it, you know, someday I think we're going to be wearing glasses with either augmented reality or mixed reality in including the real world or in the virtual reality. I'm I think that's surprising that people are able to spend time in it, and it's impressive to me that you've gotten people to go through whole courses with it. Anyway, thank you for a great talk, and next month we're going to have Nancy Frischberg, somebody that's been in Bake High for decades, give a talk about language. So thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Thanks for having me.